There is a moment in football history when one team stops being a club and becomes a philosophy, and the entire sport is never the same again. What happened in Milan between 1988 and 1994 was not just dominance. It was a hostile takeover of the game itself. The coaches who followed tried to copy it. The players who faced it never forgot it. And the tactical blueprint it left behind became the most studied document in the history of the sport. Yet almost nobody tells the full story of how it was built, or the chaos and doubt that nearly stopped it before it ever began. To understand what Milan became, you must first understand what Milan was: a sleeping giant buried under debt, scandal and humiliation in the shadow of their own city. In 1986, the club that had once been called the club of the century was rotting from the inside. The Tottenero match-fixing scandal of 1980 had torn through Italian football like a blade, and Milan had been cut the deepest, relegated to Serie B in disgrace. The wounds were financial, reputational and psychological, a great club that had learned to distrust itself. Founded in 1899 by English expatriates who wanted to bring their game to northern Italy, Milan Football and Cricket Club was born from an outsider spirit, a love of something foreign, something new, something nobody else in the city fully understood yet. That outsider energy would prove to be the club's greatest recurring gift. By the time Silvio Berlusconi walked into the club in 1986, checkbook in hand and ambition burning behind his eyes, Milan was an institution in crisis. But Berlusconi did not see a ruin. He saw a canvas, and he had already decided who would paint on it. Arrigo Sacchi had never played professional football. This single fact nearly ended his career before it started. When Berlusconi appointed him as Milan head coach in 1987, the Italian football establishment reacted with something between laughter and outrage. One veteran journalist famously wrote that you do not need to have been a horse to become a jockey, but nobody believed that applied here. Sacchi arrived at Milan with ideas so radical they sounded like the ramblings of a dreamer. He wanted to press. He wanted compactness. He wanted the entire team to move as one breathing organism. The resistance inside the dressing room was fierce. Milan contained some of the most decorated and strong-willed players in Italian football, men who had survived the dark years and believed they already knew how the game was played. Sacchi told them they knew nothing. The arguments were volcanic. If you have ever felt that the things worth building are always the hardest to start, then this story is for you. Football Untold exists to tell these forgotten chapters, the ones that never make the highlight reels. If you believe football is more than just the final score, follow this channel and never miss an untold story again. Berlusconi backed his coach completely. When players demanded Sacchi be removed, the owner stood firm in a way that shocked Italian football culture, where boardroom capitulation to dressing room power was almost tradition. This alignment of owner and coach created something rare, a club with a single unified football brain. Then came the Dutch. Ruud Gullit, Marco van Basten and Frank Rijkaard arrived in Milan like three instruments that had been waiting for the right composer. Together with Sacchi's system, they would produce music that football had no word for yet. The turning point arrived in 1988 like a thunderclap. Milan won the Serie A title, their first in 9 years, and did so playing football that left opponents and commentators genuinely lost for tactical language. Nobody had seen a team defend from the front before. Nobody had seen pressure used as art. But the true announcement to the world came in Europe. Milan entered the European Cup of 1988-89 with something to prove to a continent that still thought Italian football meant defensive caution. What followed in the semi-final against Real Madrid was one of the most complete tactical destructions in football history. 5-0 across 2 legs. Real Madrid, the most storied club in European football, were dismantled by a system that had no mercy and no gaps. Sacchi watched from the touchline with the calm expression of a man who had always known this was possible, even when nobody else did. The European Cup final in Barcelona in 1989 became the stage for the crowning of a new football order. Steaua Bucharest, the reigning champions, faced a Milan team that had been building toward this moment since the very first training session Sacchi had conducted in the face of total disbelief. 4-0. Milan did not beat Steaua Bucharest in that final. They educated them. Van Basten scored twice with a clinical precision that made the television cameras seem inadequate. The screen was simply not wide enough to capture what was happening. Milan retained the European Cup the following year, beating Benfica in Vienna, cementing their status as the dominant force in continental football. 2 European Cups in 2 years. The football world was not just watching, it was furiously taking notes. Then, in a move that shocked even those who believed they understood Italian football politics, Sacchi left for the Italy national team role in 1991. The dynasty he had built now needed a new mind to run it. The board turned to a man whose approach could not have been more different, Fabio Capello. Where Sacchi was a philosopher of football, Capello was a general. He stripped the game back to its bones: results, discipline, organization, winning. His Milan would be less beautiful than Sacchi's and infinitely more ruthless. Under Capello between 1991 and 1996, Milan would win 4 Serie A titles. The 1991-92 Serie A season produced something almost supernatural. Milan went the entire league campaign unbeaten, losing 0 matches across 34 games. It remains one of the greatest single-season achievements in the history of European club football. The European Cup final of 1994 against Barcelona stands as perhaps the most astonishing result of the entire era. Barcelona, managed by Johan Cruyff and playing what was called the Dream Team, were considered by many to be the best club side on earth. Milan destroyed them 4-0. Capello watched it all from the touchline with the expression of a man confirming a mathematical theorem. This was not passion driving Milan that night in Athens. It was something colder and more devastating: total belief in a system, applied with absolute precision against the greatest team in the world. Between Sacchi and Capello, the players who wore that red and black shirt wrote a collective biography of excellence that staggered the imagination. Gullit with his dreadlocks and aerial power. Van Basten with his technically impossible finishing. Rijkaard with his controlled aggression. Baresi with his defensive leadership. Maldini with his elegance. Costacurta with his reading of the game. What made this Milan unlike any dynasty before it was that their greatness was repeatable, transferable and explainable. Sacchi could describe why they were good. Capello could operationalize it differently and still win. The ideas were bigger than any individual player, and that was entirely intentional. The shadow that this Milan cast across the world of football coaching is almost impossible to measure. Jurgen Klopp studied the Sacchi press. Pep Guardiola cited the Milan block as a foundational influence. José Mourinho, who was at Barcelona the night Capello destroyed Cruyff's dream team, later admitted it changed how he understood winning. The culture of the city of Milan itself was permanently marked by what this team achieved. The San Siro, always a cathedral, became something closer to a symbol of Italian national identity during these years. Children who watched from the terraces became coaches, journalists and players who carried the memory of red and black perfection into the next generation of the game. Paolo Maldini spent the rest of his career at Milan carrying the standards that Sacchi had raised, eventually becoming the longest-serving embodiment of what those 6 years had meant. He retired in 2009, having never played for another club. The values planted in 1988 were still alive in him 4 decades later. History remembers dynasties by their trophies. 3 European Cups, 5 Serie A titles, 2 Intercontinental Cups, 2 European Super Cups. The silverware of the Sacchi and Capello era is staggering on its own. But the trophies are not why football still talks about this Milan. They talk about it because it proved that football could be a science and an art simultaneously. 2 coaches who could not have been more different. One who believed football was philosophy, and one who believed it was warfare. Both were right. And together, across 6 extraordinary years, they produced something that the game is still trying to fully understand: the proof that a club can be greater than the sum of its genius. Every generation of football fans inherits the giants of the past and carries the responsibility of remembering them honestly, not just the trophies, but the doubt, the defiance, the madness and the vision that made those trophies possible. This was the untold story of AC Milan. If it moved you, if it reminded you why football matters beyond the score, follow Football Untold and never let the real stories be forgotten.